Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. In this lesson, we'll extend the IPO flow model we've talked about before by building a SIPOC. As an extension of the IPO flow model, it may help to review the Introduction to Lean and Six Sigma lesson and the problem resolution using DMAIC lesson. Right now, let's begin with showing you how a SIPOC is a natural extension of the IPO flow model and can ultimately lead to a detailed process map. We need to remember that our goal for the define phase is that we're trying to understand the pain and severity being felt within the business. What's truly the problem that we're trying to understand. Now, we can do this by understanding the business processes where the actual problem exists. So in order to do that, we can look at the IPO flow model, the SIPOC, and process mapping tools to give us a better understanding of that. Well, it begins with the IPO flow model. Again, this is asking what are the inputs that feed into the process to create the outputs. Now from here we can use this to extend to build the SIPOC itself. That is, the IPO is just the inner part of the SIPOC. SIPOC is referring to the suppliers who create or supply us with the inputs that feed into our process and ultimately create the outputs, and from there those outputs are provided to a customer. Well, again, the SIPOC is merely saying who are the suppliers of those inputs and who are the customers receiving our outputs. So it's extending the IPO flow model in that way. Well, as part of building the SIPOC, we get into more detailed steps of the process itself. And it's with that process that we can build then the process map, giving us a better understanding of the detailed steps of the entire business process where we're feeling the pain, or at least to help us identify somewhere within the process where the pain is being felt. Okay, so let's define specifically what a SIPOC is. Well, a SIPOC is what extends the input, process, output flow model by identifying who the supplier is providing the inputs and who the customer is that's receiving the outputs from that process. So what's the purpose of a SIPOC? Is to identify the required inputs and all possible sources that are providing those inputs. It's also a way to identify the high-level critical steps within the business process, and also a way to identify who the ultimate customer is, or those receiving our outputs that were created by the process. And also it's a way for us to understand the relationship for that entire flow from the supplier all the way to the customer. So as an example of what a SIPOC looks like, we'll say here's an example of one if you're building a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. As part of the SIPOC, what we need to identify is what's the start of the process. Where do we begin and where we're mapping the process, and where do we end in mapping that particular process, because the process is really the heart of what we're trying to identify with the SIPOC. But as part of building the SIPOC, what we need to further identify is, again, the inputs that feed into the process, and then again, who's the supplier for those inputs. And again, we're trying to say, after following this process, this is ultimately what we're trying to create as an output, and who's the receiver or customer of that output that we're building. Now let's talk about how you can build a SIPOC. Well, there are several steps you could follow when trying to build a SIPOC. First, you got to start with your team. Get them together, because when you build your SIPOC, it should be a collaborative effort as a product from the entire team. It should not just be something created by one person in a vacuum. So when you begin, define the starting and ending part of the process. That is, what is the starting point of the process and what's the stopping point of the process. Make sure you clearly define those up front, and make sure that you've got those boundaries set and the context set for the different elements within the SIPOC itself. Next, you want to fill in each of the different columns within the SIPOC using one of two methods. First of all, you can follow the typical SIPOC method, which is going from left to right, where you begin with the supplier of asking who provides the information, resources, and materials that are being used in the process. Then you want to identify what are the information, resources, or materials needed for this process. Then what's the actual process steps themselves at a high level. And then what is the output from the process that the customer is willing to pay for. And finally, who is the customer? Who's the one benefiting from or willing to pay for that particular output? A different method you can follow is not just following from left all the way to right. That is one effective way, but you also could go from right, starting with the customer, and going backwards to the supplier, or what's called the COPIS method. This could be really effective as a way to see how you're understanding things from the customer's perspective first. That is, looking at their expectations and requirements at first, and then working yourself backwards. Both methods can be very effective. Now, the last thing you want to do is for the different inputs and outputs, you want to identify the requirements. So for example, for the input requirements, you want to ask what's the criteria for an acceptable input, the things that are non-defective that are coming into you as an input into your process. And then finally, what are the output requirements? That is, what are the requirements from the customer, the things that you're creating coming out of your process that's considered to be a non-defect that the customer is willing to pay for. All right, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way. Well, I'd like to challenge you to think of two different processes. They could be processes either that you have personally or ones at work, and try to think of a process that you're pretty familiar with. And it doesn't matter how large the process is. Actually, I'd almost prefer that you do something on a smaller scale so you can get comfortable with it, but it's okay if you want to do something larger instead. Now, for each of those, first start with one process and try to build a SIPOC using some of these questions below. What's the start of the process, that starting point where the process should begin? Then what's the ending point or the stopping point of the process? And then from the supplier perspective, who's providing the information, resources, and materials being used within the process? For the inputs themselves, what is the information or what are those resources or materials that are needed for the process? And what are the input requirements for those? What's the criteria for what you consider to be an acceptable input, something that's non-defective that you're receiving? And then what's the process itself, those high-level steps that are transforming those inputs in order to create the desired output? And then what are the outputs? What is that output that you're creating for your process that the customer is willing to pay for? Identify as well there, what are the output requirements, the things that the customer is expecting, that is their requirements or expectations, what's called the voice of the customer or VOC. And then finally, who's the customer? Who's the one that's benefiting or willing to pay for that particular output coming out of that process? I'll challenge you to follow that in that order with those questions. But then for the other process that you identified, try doing the same exact thing, answering the same exact questions, but go in reverse order, where you're beginning with the customer and then working yourself backwards, following the COPUS model instead of the SIPOC, which was left to right. And then, which of those methods, when you tried each one of those, which do you think was easier for you to follow, the SIPOC or the COPUS method? And why was it any easier than the other one? Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.